Hello comrades, this is more of just a fun video. It doesn't really have, it's not really about a serious or really important political topic. Well, I guess it kinda is, but basically what I just wanted to talk about was my favorite kinds of Soviet and socialist films. I've been a big fan of cinema for, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years, so not too long. Before that, I wasn't too interested in it. I watched movies like everyone else does, but I got into this kind of a weird story, but I got into the work of James Rolfe. He's, I suppose, like an internet comedian. He's the guy behind the Angry Video Game Nerd character. So I got into that. I thought AVGN was really funny, so I went to his website, cinemassacre.com, and there I noticed that he had all these things about the history of horror films, and that was pretty interesting. So I think the first video he ever made about, like, he has this long-running series called Monster Madness, which is a series that he basically makes one horror film review per day through the month of October every year, leading up to Halloween, of course. I think the first video he ever made for Monster Madness was about the 1927, I think it's 1927, German horror film called Nosferatu, which is probably one of my, I would say, it might be my favorite horror film of all time. I love Nosferatu. Watching those reviews of classic horror films, and then watching those films themselves, because, a lot of them are public domain, you can just find them online and watch them. That's what got me into film. So anyway, then pretty quickly I got into Soviet cinema as well, because I was interested in this film genre or movement called German expressionism. Nosferatu is considered a German expressionist film. There's another one that I really like called Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. That's totally like a fantastic film. I really love that one. Then there's another one called Metropolis, which is a science fiction film. That's a really great one. There's lots of good ones. So anyway, the idea behind German expressionism is that visual aspects of the film are used to represent emotions. Not even necessarily emotions, they could be plot elements as well, or other aspects. Like, for example, in Nosferatu, the idea is that there's this vampire. It's a kind of an adaptation of Dracula, but they never got rights to Dracula, so the copyrights, so that's why they called it Nosferatu instead. But basically there's this vampire, and the vampire is usually depicted, they don't typically show the vampire himself, they show his shadow, and that's because they wanted to depict the vampire as pure darkness, so he is a shadow. Also, that's where these days everyone knows that a vampire, can't stand sunlight. Well, that actually doesn't originate from the book Dracula, it originates from Nosferatu, the film, because at the end of the film, the vampire, of course, like, the sunlight causes him to burn and like engulf in flames. But that has to do with German expressionism, because the vampire is supposed to be pure darkness, and so that's why light hurts him. Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is another good example, because in that one, the set design, the sets and architecture is totally distorted and messed up because it reflects the narrator's insanity. That's a bit of a spoiler, but anyway, the entire, like, the set design is created to be distorted to basically reflect insanity. So anyway, when I was looking for more German expressionist films, I stumbled upon this Soviet film called Battleship Potemkin, which is also sometimes considered an expressionist film. And I can understand why, even though it is pretty realistic in compared to expressionist films typically. But of course, it's a very famous film. It's by the Soviet film director Sergei Eisenstein, and it's about the 1905 revolution in the Russian Empire, and it largely takes place on this battleship. There's a mutiny on board, but there's it shows other events as well that happened at the time. One really important aspect, a really significant aspect in terms of film history that has to do with Potemkin is the fact that Sergei Eisenstein invented the so-called montage technique, which is these days it's pretty much used by every director. Like there's almost no film like these days that doesn't have montage in it. But montage was used to a great effect in the early Soviet cinema, the 20s silent film, and basically Eisenstein's theory of montage, the idea was to use editing to create emotional response in the viewer. So instead of some other thing like visual images or acting or something, instead it uses editing to do that, and the rhythm in the editing. For example, in his famous film October, there's the scene that precedes the so-called July days, when the masses were ready to rebel, but the Bolsheviks said that it's too early, we're not strong enough, we shouldn't rebel yet. But they knew that the masses were going to rebel anyway, they couldn't stop them. So the Bolsheviks decided that, okay, we're going to participate in these demonstrations, but we're going to be there in order to make sure that it doesn't escalate too badly. But of course, it still escalated. People brought guns and it got really violent. And the Tsarist government actually fired into the crowd with machine guns. And that's also when the Bolshevik Party was basically destroyed and Lenin had to flee the country and all that. Of course, they regrouped and Lenin returned and the revolution happened and all that. But anyway, the scene where they show the machine guns firing into the crowd, the way it's edited, there's like 1 second of they like show the machine gun firing for like a half a second. Then they show the reaction of the crowd, which is like dispersing and running away. Then they return, show like half a second of the machine gun, half a second of the crowd, half a second of the machine gun. And it's basically, the entire thing is edited in this machine gun rapid fire, blah, 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 to create this effect. So that's a cool little moment. In Battleship Potemkin, there was also another cool moment when the Tsar's Cossacks are basically gunning down innocent people in Odessa, which actually happened. These are all, like, both of these films they're based on real events. In editing it, they used this certain rhythm to simulate the march of the soldiers. Of course, these movies were also accompanied by music, because even though they're silent movies, but typically when they used to show silent movies in theaters, they would have like an orchestra playing music, and they would like have a specific film score and everything. Another cool detail was that I think there's a moment where there's a Tsarist officer who like looks at the ruthless violence that's being carried out by his soldiers, and he's like smiling, and then places his hand on his sword and kind of like drums his fingers on the sword, and then it shows a priest, like an Orthodox priest, who is doing the same motion. He's like placing his hand on his crucifix and then like tapping his fingers on the crucifix. So it immediately, you immediately understand what is being implied here, that they're both basically the same. They're servants of the Tsar, and the other one uses weapons to kill people. The other one uses religion to control people. So anyway, I got really interested in the Soviet cinema. There was a school of directors who were doing these kinds of montage films. So I'm just gonna name off a couple of directors in case you wanna check them out. So there's Sergei Eisenstein, of course. If you wanna get into Soviet cinema, I would recommend. I haven't seen like tons of these films, but I've seen a bunch. But there's a lot of films that I haven't seen I should watch. Battleship Potemkin is really famous, and it's widely available on DVD, and it's also available online. So that's really famous. It's an easy film to follow, and it's pretty short. It's not like crazy length, but you might find it less interesting because it's not about the October Revolution, it's about the 1905 Revolution, but it's very, very famous. The Odessa Steps scene has been parodied in like tons of places and, referenced in tons of films because it's just such a famous scene. So that's a good place to start. He also made a film called Strike, which is also really good. Actually, they showed that pretty recently on Finnish TV, so that's quite good. It's about a 1903 strike in a big factory. But in my opinion, his best film was October. October was made after those two films. It's much longer and it's significantly more difficult to get into because sometimes it has a slow pace. There's tons of stuff happening in it. So if you don't know your history, then it might be a little bit difficult to understand what is happening, because it is based on real events. So it doesn't necessarily explain everything too well, because it was made in 1928, or finished in 1928. It was meant to be like a 10-year anniversary film for the October Revolution. So people at the time, of course, knew what was happening, but modern audiences don't necessarily know. But it actually can be good to learn history from this film, because if you kind of have a hazy idea of what the October Revolution was, then if you watch this film, it can refresh your memory. If there's the July days, there's the Kornilov revolt, and all those things, the June offensive, and all that stuff. Not only is it longer and more difficult because there's so much stuff happening, but also it's a lot more artsy and it's a lot more abstract, and it was actually criticized for this reason. Eisenstein called it intellectual montage. I'm reading from the Wikipedia page of the movie. It says that the editing together of shots of apparently unconnected objects in order to create and encourage intellectual comparisons between them. So like I was saying, for example, in Potemkin, how they have the priest and the army officer. So it says here, one of the film's celebrated examples of this technique is a Baroque image of Jesus that is compared through a series of shots to Hindu deities, the Buddha, Aztec gods, and finally a primitive idol in order to suggest the sameness of all religions. The idol is then compared with military regalia to suggest the linking of patriotism and religious fervor by the state. So it can be a little bit more difficult to maybe understand this kind of film. But my three favorite moments from the film are like when Lenin appears for the first time. It's amazing. Like, I got chills when I saw that. It happens pretty late in the film too. I think it happens like 40 minutes into the film, but it was amazing. Another great moment is at the very beginning. It starts with an image of this huge statue of the Tsar being torn down by a mob of people rebelling. And later on in the film, when Kerensky is the leader of the provisional government and he begins to gun down the demonstrators, it shows the same footage from the beginning of the film of the statue of the Tsar being torn down, but it shows it in reverse, so that it looks like the statue is actually rebuilding itself. It's getting repaired. So that was a really cool moment, because it really demonstrates that this so-called revolutionary provisional government was actually a counter-revolution that was restoring the old order, removing like all progress that had been made by the revolution previously. And also another cool moment was there's this scene with two Napoleons. It's Kerensky, then all of a sudden it shows him as Napoleon, because he is he's just totally power hungry, and he's committed to the First World War. He doesn't want to end Russia's involvement in the war. And then it shows the Kornilov coup, and it shows Kornilov approaching Petrograd, and it shows Kornilov also as a Napoleon. And then there's these two Napoleons fighting each other. So it's a bit abstract in that sense. It can be weird. And the Soviet government and the party, they criticized it because they said that it was unintelligible to the masses and that it was formalist. So formalism focuses more on the form of things rather than the content of things. So I can sort of understand that criticism. It can be unintelligible to people who don't necessarily know all these things. Like I was a bit confused at first. I can also kind of understand them calling it excessively formalistic, but at the end of the day, I really like it. In my opinion, it works as a propaganda film because it gives all the information, shows what happened, gives people the picture of what happened from the communist perspective. But not only, and it's entertaining also in that regard. Not only that, it also is artistic enough to be interesting to people who are just interested in cinema, not only interested in politics or entertainment. So it works on multiple levels, although I do agree that Potemkin, for example, is a much better propaganda film because it's much more, fast-paced action, entertaining, simple to understand. Then let's move to the second thing on my list of favorites among the Soviet cinema. Oh yeah, I guess I promised to list some of these directors. So Grigory Alexandrov is another famous director. He was actually the co-director in on October, and apparently he directed the Soviet film Volga Volga from 1938, which is a like this light-hearted musical comedy. Apparently, it was Stalin's favorite film. Personally have not seen it. I've seen clips from it, but I haven't watched it. But that's just an interesting piece of trivia. I've seen a couple of those sort of like musical type things, but they're not really typically my thing. Then Vsevolod Pudovkin. Some of these names are a bit tricky for me to pronounce. But he was also a famous director, screenwriter, and also an actor. And some of the good films by him that I've seen are there's End of St. Petersburg and Storm over Asia. Apparently he played a part in Eisenstein film Ivan the Terrible, so that's a little piece of trivia. His films are not quite as good in my opinion, but I remember them being pretty entertaining. Also, yeah, he made this pretty well-known film called The Mother from 1926. It says here on the Wikipedia page that it's a 1926 Soviet film depicting one woman's struggle against Tsarist rule during the Russian Revolution of 1905. It's based on the 1906 novel The Mother by Maxim Gorky, and it's the first film in Pudovkin's so-called revolutionary trilogy alongside The End of St. Petersburg and Storm over Asia. So before we move to other things, the last director from the montage school that I wanted to name was Alexander Dovchenko, who was a Ukrainian director, and he made a bunch of cool films, but particularly he made what is known as the Ukraine trilogy. 3 films, the first of which is called Zvenigora. I don't know how that's supposed to be pronounced, but I tried. And it's from 1928, and it says here on the Wikipedia page that it's regarded as a silent revolutionary epic. Dovchenko's initial film in his Ukraine trilogy, along with Arsenal and Earth, those are the 2 other films, is almost religious in tone, relating a millennium of Ukrainian history through the story of an old man who tells his grandson about a treasure buried in a mountain. The film mixes fiction and reality, so yeah, it says here that it's highly atypical to Soviet cinema, and it's avant-garde. It is pretty avant-garde. It is really weird. It's much more artsy and weird than his other films, even though his other films are also kind of crazy. But it's cool. It has this really hypnotic atmosphere. It says that at the time of the release, it was widely reviewed in the press, but generally regarded as not conforming with Soviet aesthetics. In 1927, even before the film's release, the newspaper Kino sharply criticized the screenplay, calling it bourgeois and nationalistic. So I can understand that. It is kind of like that. But remember, this is like within the context of communism. Like, it is a communist film. But other communists were saying that, this film is a bit too nationalistic, a bit too bourgeois, But it's not like anything compared to actual bourgeois films. And the second film is Arsenal, alternate title January Uprising in Kiev in 1918. It basically depicts the Kiev Arsenal January Uprising, where Bolshevik workers took over the Kiev Arsenal weapons factory. that particular revolt was crushed. Although of course the Red Army won. And this is also a bit atypical of Soviet films because it's really depressing. It's really sad, and it says here on the wiki page that one of the few Soviet political films which seems even to cast doubt on the morality of violent retribution. And it says here that Dovchenko's eye for wartime absurdities, for example, an attack on an empty trench, anticipates the later pacifist sentiments in films by Jean Renoir and Stanley Kubrick. So yeah, it's really anti-war. It shows this. It starts with this scene from the First World War where these soldiers attack this trench, but the trench is empty and it's actually filled with poison gas. I think it's called laughing gas. It makes you laugh, then you die. So they storm the trench, but it's empty. There's no enemies. They breathe the gas, they start laughing, and then they all just die. So it's pretty, it gives a good indication of the film's tone. It's really depressing, but it's good. Then his last film in this trilogy, called Zemlya, or Earth, is from 1930, and it's about the collectivization of agriculture in Ukraine. So I quite like this one. I think it's probably best of them. Like Arsenal is kind of stylistically maybe the best, because it has the classic silent film look. This, because it's from 1930, it's a bit more modern. It's right there, like on the border between sound and silent film. It's pretty typical, like it's the classic kind of collectivization film. It's about these peasants in this village. There's of course the poor peasants want to take over the kulaks' land. The kulaks try to resist it. They set up a collective. They get their first tractor, which nobody has seen a tractor before. They, of course, they don't know how to use it properly. They try to plow their land and stuff. Then there's a struggle between the main character loses his faith in God, so he has a conflict with the clergy. They want to bury this guy. I think the kulak shoots one of the collective farmers. I think it was the leader of the collective movement in that village. Gets shot by a kulak. And then there's the funeral, of course. Then they get into a fight with the clergy because they say they want him to be buried in a way that's not so overtly religious. So yeah, but most of these films are actually on YouTube, so you can take a look at them. Actually, I think on my Marxist-Leninist Theory channel, there's a playlist called Socialist Films and TV or something like that. I think all of these are on that playlist. Should be. Then let's talk about socialist realist films. Because the 20s, the films were more experimental. They used the montage, intellectual montages and stuff like that. And because they were silent films, they weren't as realistic anyway. But in the 30s and 40s and 50s, the films started to be a lot more realistic. They didn't have these crazy camera angles. They didn't have these crazy montages that, with like crazy editing and crazy rhythm and stuff. They were pretty realistic. And then there was the big element of music, of course, as opposed to the silent films. Like they had, a lot of them were kind of like almost musical, not really musical, but like all these big epic films, they had an amazing, they always had this amazing score. So one of these directors I really like is a Georgian director, Mikhail Chiarelli, and he made some very well-known films. My two favorites are The Vow and The Fall of Berlin. The Vow is from 1946 and The Fall of Berlin is from 1949. There's other good ones. I mean, they're all good pretty much. The Great Dawn is really good. They were also really popular in the Soviet Union at the time. So The Vow, it's about the history of the Soviet Union from, I would say, from right before Lenin dies and then to pretty much the end of the 5-year plan. So it's another historical film, but it has some fictional characters in it. So it starts with this guy who is living in Tsaritsyn, which later became Stalingrad. He is carrying a letter to Lenin to basically inform Lenin that there's these roaming bands of kulaks who are just killing collective farmers and killing communists. So the kulaks catch him, they kill him. So his widow, basically, his widow finds the body and the letter, and then with some other people they travel to Moscow, and they basically go to Lenin's dacha and say that they wanna deliver this letter to Lenin. And there's all these other people who also want to speak with Lenin, because people would go and complain about their problems. So anyway, when they arrive, they hear that Lenin is dead. Then there's this whole thing about the struggle in the party between Molotov and Mikoyan and Stalin and Kalinin, and then these other people, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin. And anyway, basically, the term vow comes. The idea is that Stalin, when Lenin dies, Stalin vows that he's gonna basically fulfill all of Lenin's projects, like building socialism in Russia and so forth. So then there's this epic scene where Stalin is giving this speech after Lenin's death, and the woman who wanted to deliver the letter to Lenin is in the crowd, and then one of the people in her group is like, "Why don't you give the letter to Stalin instead?" So then she goes and gives it to Stalin, and then there's the all kinds of stuff about the 5-year plan. So that's a pretty interesting film. It's pretty cool. Considering it's not a war film, it's surprisingly really entertaining and really interesting. But then the other film, The Fall of Berlin, that's really famous. So that's a Chiarelli film as well, and that has a Shostakovich score, really good score as well. It's a really good song. That's like a 2-part, 4-hour epic about the Second World War. So it starts with just before the war. There's this Stakhanovite worker who falls in love with this, I think, school teacher, and then their life is basically perfect. The Stakhanovite worker is getting like all kinds of praise because his work is good. Then everything basically goes to shit when the Germans invade. So then he has to join the army, of course, and then the woman is captured by the Germans and taken to a concentration camp, and then anyway, they fight their way to Berlin, and there's a happy ending. She is rescued, she survives, and all that. And the film, it's amazing. It's an amazing film. The music is great. It's a color film. It's from 49, I think, 1949, or maybe it's from 1950. But it's a color film. It's available on YouTube. You can watch it. It's great. Stalin is not really a main character, but he's kind of there in the background. There's this one famous scene in the end where he gives this speech. He arrives in Berlin, and people make a big deal about this because Stalin didn't actually, like, he didn't really fly to Berlin to give a speech. Like, no shit. It's a movie, you know. It didn't really happen like that. But anyway, he arrives in Berlin, gives this big speech about, now the war is over, we will have peace, and, please just have lasting peace and no more wars, please. Okay? So, anyway, people said that it's like a big distortion of history or something. No, it's just a way for the film to end, because, like, of course it doesn't make any sense. Like, they win, they take over Berlin, and then immediately they start, like, dancing and playing music in the streets and stuff like that. It wouldn't really happen like that. It would be kind of boring if the film was realistic, in the sense that, like, the conclusion needs to be pretty quick. They need to just, okay, they win, then they celebrate, then there's the speech. They can't just, have it be like, okay, we win, then we take weeks or days to get, like, properly secure the area, and then, like, for Stalin to travel to Berlin, like, on a train. I think he, like, traveled there on a train, and stuff like that. Doesn't really matter much if he flew there or if he took a train. But it just wouldn't make any sense if he just arrived there on a train so quickly. But one thing I want to point out about that film is that the guy who plays Hitler, and actually the guy who plays Churchill as well, they look exactly like their real-life counterparts. Like, the guy who played Hitler, it's uncanny. He looks exactly like Hitler. The acting is amazing. The score is amazing. The entire film is great. It's kind of over the top. I mean, the fight scenes, it's kind of silly, but it's 1950s, so And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is the Soviet science fiction films from the pretty much like mostly from the 50s, 60s, 70s. Although they made some earlier, like I think Alida, Queen of Mars, is from the 20s, and then there's one called The Cosmic Voyage from the 30s, which is pretty good. But especially like the 50s and 60s ones are really good. So even before I got into Soviet cinema that much, I was already watching those because I was into science fiction. So those are genuinely good films. The political message in them is also very good. Like I think the Stalin era sort of epic war films with the music, like the semi-musical things, they idealize the war too much, in my opinion. It makes it seem like the war is kind of cool. There's always a happy ending too. They're always very uplifting, and you leave the film with a positive attitude. But that said, like even if it is they're war movies, but they have this really strong peace message. But it kind of glorifies war. But the Soviet sci-fi films, they're not as political. It's more subtle. They're kinda about the space race, like a lot of them. Like the Cosmic Voyage, even though it's from the 30s, it already shows the Soviets conquering space. There's like a bunch of those kinds of films, and they're actually in many ways they're superior, like much superior to Western science fiction films. But they're pretty different. Like Western sci-fi at the time was mostly indie films, independent films, rather than big budget films. That's why most of them are black and white, have shitty actors and crummy special effects. But because they were low budget, while at the same time the Soviet films were made by the state, they were in color, had professional actors, great special effects, and the American films and British films focused on usually like horror aspects of it. It was like about creatures created by nuclear radiation, like giant spider monsters and giant insects in general. There were tons of giant insect films. Of course, the famous example of this kind of film from Japan is Gojira, or Godzilla, from the 50s. But that's actually a very good film. And then a lot of these American films were about alien invasions. A lot of these, I like American sci-fi a lot, and I'm more into horror than just straight up sci-fi. But the Soviet films were in many ways, like in terms of production, they were far superior. And ironically, like there's this film called Planet of the Storms from 1962 from the Soviet Union.
Ran the camera in reverse so it looked like it was grabbing him. Traditionally, a problem when shooting these kinds of effects, these plants never worked. They were just floppy props, and it would always look like the actor was grabbing the tentacle and wrapping it around their neck, or the actor was making the plant move. Well, clearly he wanted to avoid that, and he engineered a terrific little effect for the sequence. They obviously had the plant closed and let it flop open, and by filming it in reverse, it looked like it closed up. Another interesting idea that Pavel had for the traveling about on the surface of Venus was this notion of a hovercraft, or an all-terrain vehicle, which is actually a very beautiful design. And for many years, people looked at the shot and were looking for the wires again. Where's the rig? They're presuming that this was slung from a crane on wires and floated over the surface. In actuality, the mechanism was underneath and going away from the vehicle. It was mounted on a camera crane arm that was boomed out and cantilevered out over the set and went away from the camera and dropped below the terrain. And the rocks on the set in the foreground hid the track, the mechanism, the support, everything. So it was really levitated. It looked like it was levitating and hovering out there, and there were no wires anywhere. It was well worth doing because, again, it's a tour de force. There are no wires. There's a gap underneath the ship. How is this possible? And again, he didn't go for the obvious. It would have been much simpler to hang it on wires, throw some smoke, and say, hey, you know, if they see the wires, who cares? Planet of Storms featured actually a very remarkable robot. What was really impressive about this suit was the mechanics of the claw mechanism of the arm and all the hydraulic rams that had been built in that looked functional, which were really essentially just props. Also, the massive design of the sense of strength that this robot had made it a really imposing and memorable character. Mechanically, it was achieved fairly simply. It was a weightlifter who was inside of a fiberglass fabrication.
And these American film producers, they bought rights to the film and used special effects from that film to make several new films. They used footage from Planet of Storms and another Soviet sci-fi film in multiple American sci-fi films, and then they also they took Planet of the Storms and then made an American version of it with you know, they took all the political stuff out, which wasn't much, but there was just a couple of lines that they took out, and then they just had American actors instead of Russian actors, because I don't know, Americans for some reason can't read subtitles. They made another film out of it. Actually, it's pretty weird. Like, The Guardian pretty recently made a list of Soviet science fiction films people should see. There's Alita, the first one. Then there's Cosmic Voyage, which I already mentioned. Road to the Stars, Planet of Storms, and a bunch of others. Solaris, Pilot Perks, Inquest. That one I've never seen. Just so many cool Soviet films. This is not really about the Soviet Union, but there's this director called Karel Zeman from Czechoslovakia, who made a series of films based on the work of the French science fiction author Jules Verne, or Jules Verne, I can't fucking pronounce that name. Anyway, he made a bunch of Jules Verne films. Those are all great. They're kind of like targeted towards children, and they're not really political, but they're just great.
Karel Zeman, a magician of the big screen. Once one of the world's most successful filmmakers. In the 1950s, his film, The Fabulous World of Jules Verne, was released in 70 countries, showing in 96 theaters in New York alone. In a small town in Czechoslovakia, he invented new ways to make films with radically inventive special effects that he combined to make groundbreaking movies. In the days before digital effects and without computers, he brought audiences around the world back to prehistoric times, forward to the moon, and deep under the sea.
Another cool thing, there was a bunch of really good East German science fiction films. They're a bit more recent, they're like from 70s, 80s. The Silent Star, it's a East German Polish production. There's an English version called First Spaceship on Venus, where they censored all the political stuff because they make reference to the bombing of Hiroshima and some things like that. So those were all removed from the American version. That's a pretty good one. The American version is really shitty though, because it has horrible like dubbing and stuff. But I encourage people to check out these East German films as well. They're pretty good if you're into science fiction. The Soviets also, and other Eastern European and socialist countries also made a bunch of cool westerns. They're not really westerns though. They're kind of different. They take place in like during the Soviet Civil War, like in the wastelands and plains of Russia. There's some of them, like the Elusive Avengers trilogy, is targeted towards more like children and youth. It's more lighthearted, but they're pretty cool. But yeah, those are some of my favorite Soviet films. Different genres, 1920s montage films, 1930s and 40s and 50s, kind of like Stalin era socialist realism is really cool. And then later on, the 50s, 60s, 70s science fiction is also really cool. Also, the socialist countries didn't make too many horror films, but there's this one film from Czechoslovakia, which is from '63. It's a black and white science fiction film. It's called Ikari XB1, where this ship called Ikari XB1, they are sent to look for this planet in Alpha Centauri, but it's kind of creepy. I'm not sure if I would say that it's a horror film, but it deals with like the voyage takes them like I think over a year, more than a year, yeah, 28 months, and they find all kinds of creepy stuff. They find a derelict spaceship with nuclear weapons on board, then a deadly radioactive dark star, and then there's a mental breakdown of one of the crew, and I think they encounter some kind of a space plague. Maybe that was caused by the radiation. So that's a pretty creepy film. It's pretty cool. As I said, it's black and white, but I actually prefer black and white films to color films oftentimes. Sometimes it's just epic if it's 50s Technicolor film. They look really vibrant and cool, but I kind of like the black and white films too.